Well, good morning and welcome to MTPConnect's June webinar, Charting Your Course, Commercialising Health Innovations. My name is Rebecca Tunstall and I'm the Senior Director of Stakeholder Engagement at MTPConnect. So it's great to have you all joining us today. I would like to start with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We have some great speakers joining us today, so it was great to have you all with us. Now, before I introduce our guests, we just have some housekeeping to go through. We will be doing some polls as part of today's presentation and engagement. So I just wanted to let you know that those polls are anonymous, so please do participate. We'd like to get your feedback and get to know who's joining us on the call today. We'll also be hearing from all of our speakers and having a panel question and answer session at the end. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box, so not the chat box. And if you want to be anonymous, you can tick the box that indicates that you're submitting an anonymous question. And if you already see a question that you like, that someone else has already asked, you can actually tick on that question to get that moved to the top. If you're having audio issues, there is an option to dial in. So there's toll-free numbers on your invite. So please have a look at that if you're having trouble with your audio. And we also need to let you know that we are recording this webinar and we'll be making it available as a podcast at a later date. So as a reminder, please do subscribe to our MTPConnect podcast so you can listen to it again. Okay, so now I'd just like to welcome our guests who are joining us today. We have Dr. John Collins, Chief Operating Officer from Boston-based CIMIT, which stands for Consortia for Improving Medicine with Innovation and Technology. Thank you, John, for joining us in your evening from the US. It's great to have you with us. We have Dr. Catherine Giles, CEO and Medical Director of WA-based OncoRes Medical. Welcome, Kath. And we also have Marcus Dawe, co-founder of Health Horizons, and Marcus is based in chilly Canberra, although Melbourne's quite chilly this morning as well. So now that we know who our guests are, we'd like to get to know you a bit better, who's joining us on the call. So we're going to put up 3 poll questions. If you could just go through and answer those questions, we'll give you about a minute to do that, and then we'll get to know who's on the call today. And just don't forget to click the submit button down the bottom. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so. Okay, I think everyone should have had enough time to complete the poll. So Libby, would you like to bring up the answers? All right. Thank you for your answers. It's good to see who we've got on the call. So a lot of people on the call were at that preclinical R&D stage. And none of the above, so I'm assuming that you're interested in the topic as well. And a good spread of participants across the sector and more from MedTech. And it's good to see the biggest challenge in terms of commercialisation being leveraging funding. So thank you for participating in this poll. It gives our guests an insight into who we have on the call, so we can use that as we go through the presentation. So now I'd just like to hand over to our Managing Director and CEO of MTPConnect, Dr. Dan Grant, who will do a small introduction and then go on to introduce our guests.
Thanks, Rebecca. As Rebecca said, my name's Daniel Grant. I'm the Managing Director and CEO of MTPConnect, and we're really pleased to have everybody online today. MTPConnect, for those of you who don't know us well, is a not-for-profit independent organization that was established in 2015 as part of the federal government's Growth Center initiative. And our main mission is to help accelerate the medtech, biotech, and pharmaceutical sector within Australia. We work at the nexus between companies, patients, academics, clinicians, researchers, and government, all focused on really helping to improve commercialization and collaboration through our sector, to improve access to international supply chains, to promote and encourage the development of workforce skills, and finally to work with the government and other organizations to ensure that the regulatory and policy environment in Australia is fit for purpose for our sector. We're really pleased to have three great guests here today to talk about commercialization, and I'd like to pass now to John Collins, the COO of CIMIT. John.
Dan, thank you very much. And I've seen some names on the participant list that we've got the great pleasure to know over the years, so it's great to connect with a lot of old friends. So again, my name is John Collins, the COO of CIMIT. CIMIT's a Boston-based organization with a mission to really help teams get great technologies that are sitting in labs across the globe and get them into clinical practice. And actually, there are a couple of slides that I can really give a quick overview if this would be a good time, Rebecca.
Thanks, John. Now, Kath, would you just like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Beck. Hi, I'm Kath Giles. I'm CEO of OncoRes Medical. OncoRes is based in Perth, and we're a medical device company that is looking at developing new intraoperative imaging technologies to help the surgeons get all the cancer out the first time. So the first indication that we're looking at is breast conserving surgery, where 30% of Australian women currently have to return for further surgery within 2 weeks because the surgeon doesn't manage to remove all of the cancer, and it's only identified when the pathology is performed 7 to 10 days later.
Thanks, Kath. And Marcus.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Dawe, so I'm the co-founder of Health Horizon. Health Horizon was formed 5 years ago in an effort to help the whole sector in health, biotech, medtech, public health, and digital health to find and follow all the innovations that are happening around the world. I'm a data scientist, and my team have assembled hundreds of thousands of innovation and data points around innovation and bring them together in channels so that any innovator in health, our undertaking is that they can find competitive innovations, find funding, and also collaborate with others who are doing similar things.
Thanks so much, Marcus, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Now, I'm going to start with a question for Dan. So Dan, a key priority for our sector is achieving effective translation of research commercial outcomes that benefit patients. This requires not only effective research and startup subsectors, but a healthy full value chain ecosystem from research right through to commercial marketing and sales of products. Dan, could you just give us a bit of an overview in terms of Australia's commercialisation environment?
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, I think most people who are listening today would recognize that Australia is known for its high quality medical research. We have a number of universities in the top 50 rankings, global rankings for universities. We have strong government support for our research sector through the NHMRC, the ARC, and the MRFF, bringing in upwards of $1.5 to $2 billion of research funding each year. And so we have a very strong research sector. If you look at the Global Innovation Index and you look at the innovation inputs in that index, we rank consistently in the top 12 to 15 countries around the world. But where we do less well is in our innovation outputs, and we were ranking near the bottom of the OECD countries in terms of innovation outputs from our research. And so we're really working hard to help improve the sector. It's not to say that the sector isn't doing well. You only have to look at some of the examples of clinical discoveries that have been commercialized. Gardasil, for example, coming out of the University of Queensland. Australia will be one of the first countries to be free of cervical cancer because of Gardasil. Don't forget Cochlear, ResMed, and a host of other smaller companies. CSL, a large company. All of these are doing very well. If we look at the sector in general, you know, our medtech, biotech, and pharmaceutical sector in Australia has about 1,300 companies in it. We have about 135 listed companies on the ASX that are focused on medtech, biotech, and pharmaceuticals. Up to the end of December 2019, those listed companies had a market cap of somewhere in the order of $170 billion total market cap, which is about a 28% increase since 2016. So the sector up until January was doing very well. In fact, our sector is the 8th largest export in Australia, exporting about just over $8 billion of product and services each year. So we have fantastic infrastructure, fantastic researchers, fantastic medical infrastructure, all delivering great research outcomes. Where we really need to work harder is to improve our translation into commercial products, which ultimately have benefits to patients. So I think, you know, the takeaway message really for me is that we have a great opportunity in Australia. We have strong government support for our medical research sector, and we have a great opportunity to really work hard to help improve the translation of those discoveries into products that help benefit patients.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm going to start with asking John. You introduced what CIMIT does briefly, but if you could just go into a bit more detail about what CIMIT does, its origins and purpose, and maybe highlight some success stories that have come out of CIMIT.
Sure. So CIMIT's been around for about 20 years. It was founded by a serial entrepreneur physician, Dr. Parrish, who basically recognized the tremendous challenge that particularly physicians and people in the university had in really needing to do all of the work to get something into commercialization, particularly when people weren't really educated in that. They had to learn everything themselves. So CIMIT as an organization, its mission is to basically provide kind of the impedance match, to be able to bring together the right resources to help create technology, be they in academic settings or be they in startups, to get the resources that they need to get into commercial practice, which is what we call the CIMIT model. It's something that with now 20 years of experience, what we've been able to do is to take a look back. So as we describe the CIMIT model, we say there are 4 important elements. First, the most important thing is find important unmet medical needs, and then find teams and pieces of technology that can basically cluster together to address those. We provide funding in the grand scheme of things within Boston and the ecosystems in which we operate. It's not a lot of money. Typically, it's enough money to get to the next inflection point. So a few $100,000 up to $500,000. I think the most unique part of CIMIT is providing facilitation, providing experts who've been there, done that, to work with teams that have frankly little experience in innovation, and be able to kind of roll up their sleeves and not just provide advice, but provide guidance on how to move forward. So we've got groups of individuals that have started companies, managed companies, exited companies, that roll up their sleeves and work with our funded projects. I think the other element of CIMIT, which is fairly interesting, given the longevity that we've had, we've got a unique opportunity to really study the process of innovation in healthcare. And our mission has been to quantify that and study it to be able to share best practices. And basically, in navigating that journey, what we've developed is something we call the healthcare innovation cycle, which is really a way to be able to provide expert facilitation to de-risk projects in 4 domains. The idea here is very simple, that innovation in healthcare is a learnable, teachable process. But frankly, very few people are educated in that process. Most people involved in innovation in healthcare are great clinicians, great scientists, but they don't know anything about the challenges of innovation in healthcare. And what we've done to help them is to basically take the classic technology readiness levels, convert those to language that's familiar to people in healthcare, But I think the most important thing is, rather than worrying about just the maturity of the technology, you also simultaneously worry about the maturity of the clinical workflow issues that you need to understand, the market and business issues that you need to understand, the regulatory issues, and of course the technical and science. So you can think of this really as a 4x10 matrix. There are 10 milestones, and each one of those milestones, there are deliverables that you should have in 4 domains, which we've quantified and supported. And I think, one of the key things that we have seen, and we see the data tonight, which is really telling relative to, the belief that the biggest problem is the lack of funding. And our experience has been that the lack of funding that most early stage groups experience is not at all a lack of funding. It's a fact that the basis of funding decisions have changed, that they've been using government funding, which has been funding things based on scientific merit and novelty, and moving to commercial funding, where the funding basis is that's threshold, but what's in addition is what is the value. So those are the sorts of things where really understanding that process can take great technical and clinical teams and turn them into really powerful startups. So that's a short overview of some of our projects. We've funded now more than 1,000 projects over the years. One example, there are many examples I can talk about. One is 9-Point Medical, which is optical coherence tomography. Started probably about 15 years ago. And at this point, they've had more than $200 million invested in the product in the marketplace, and they really created, if you will, a new industry. So there are many examples of kind of the high-tech things that we've been involved in, but also many workflow issues that are not necessarily great commercial successes, but have had a significant impact on improving patient care and patient quality. So that's a quick summary.
Great, thanks, John. And you touched on one of the obstacles, well, perceived obstacles around funding, and then maybe the criteria for funding. What in your experience has been one of the biggest obstacles in terms of groups being able to adopt this model, the CIMIT model?
That's an interesting point. So I should really talk more about the fact that CIMIT's a consortium of organizations. Based in Boston, we've got 13 institutions in Boston, but we've been working with groups in Singapore, in the UK, in Spain, that have great technical resources, great clinical resources, and they basically want to adopt the CIMIT model, which is really a wiring diagram. It's connecting the various pieces in the ecosystem rather than creating new capabilities. And really, there are 2 fundamental issues that we see in adopting the CIMIT model. First, most funding organizations see facilitation as overhead. They don't see it as work, and they don't want to pay for overhead. They just want to pay for work in a lab. Well, commercialization requires work that's done outside of the lab, talking to customers, talking to regulators, et cetera. So having funding going towards these commercial elements is really critical. The other thing are politics, frankly, that we go into, and I won't mention any names of cities where they've got 3 or 4 world-class organizations, be they hospitals and universities. I say, I love the CIMIT model, it's really great, we'll take the lead. Well, collaboration is not about taking the lead. Collaboration is about sharing the network. And we quite often see kind of in an academic setting, frankly, sharing things outside of their institution is very atypical for many institutions, and it does take some experience to get over that.
Thanks, John. Marcus, in terms of Health Horizons, your organisation helps people, groups to develop competitive intelligence. Can you tell us a bit about that in terms of the approaches that people take with that in part of their planning around their development or commercialisation?
Sure. Thanks very much. So Health Horizon really is a platform that allows people to find all the innovations that are in their sector. And when you're starting out on your journey with an innovation in health, it's really, really important to understand, what are your paths to market, what are others doing in the sector, and indeed, who can you collaborate with? I think all of the innovations that we have on our platform, when you look and go deep into them on their timelines, you can see how they started and how they continue with lots of different collaborations, including obviously with the funders and early stage groups like accelerators and the like. What our platform shows through our data is that these journeys, as much as they're similar, they're actually very different as well. So what we do is we showcase these innovations as channels of innovation. And if I can just share my my screen here, I will show you something which is a typical showcase, which is this the Australian National Health Innovation Showcase. This is one that was actually funded by MTP 3 years ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. And what we have here is typically a list of all the innovations that are in a particular category. And what we do is we monitor these, and each of these individual milestones here show the progress around a particular innovation. This is the University of Melbourne particular technology. You can go and follow those. And then by following the innovation, you're kept up to date. So importantly for innovators, it's important to know what's happening in your sector. And we believe that with the use of our technology and indeed looking at the funding cycle and how innovation is funded, it's a great way to kind of attract the interest from funders, and funders range from a whole different spectrum, right from angel funding, as we know, right through to serious funding from VCs and indeed from governments. So, sorry.
Great. Thanks, Marcus. And in terms of Health Horizons, what's some of the impacts of people have been using that platform? Have people had changes to what have had to instigate changes in terms of what they were planning on developing because of information they've actually got from this platform? Or has it helped people actually fine tune when they've had more of an understanding in terms of what the competitive landscape is?
Absolutely. I think by looking at others' journeys through these milestones, they're able to assess what shortcuts or what activities that the other innovators have been doing to get to their first prototype or to get their initial funding. It's very, very important that kind of in this innovation scene that we're able to get to the first prototype, get to something that can be tested as soon as possible. This is one of the main kind of failings with a lot of innovators, is that they put too much effort into getting possibly too far down the track without validation. And I suppose kind of also John Collins's approach, when you can start to see where you are on this roadmap, where you are on this innovation journey, it sharpens you very quickly towards what you need to do next, where you need to go, where you potentially need to get your first funding, and also which experts and which groups are doing and are in your field. So what we provide is a way for you to find particularly where people have gone, and it might be a similar place that you might get your funding as to where others have got their funding. So this is all about collaboration. And so we really showcase the collaboration by lining up innovations that are in the same area, whether it's medtech or biotech or digital health or even public health. Case in point is around the activity around telehealth that's just happened as a result of COVID. Telehealth is just burgeoning now as a sector. It was quite pent up, but there's a lot of new investment that's coming into this. And so knowing what's going on in telehealth, particularly in your area, in your region, in your sector, is really, really important.
Thanks, Marcus. And I suppose you've touched on something in terms of, and I suppose it ties in with John's CIMIT model as well, in terms of, you know, how early do you start looking at the competitive landscape? Does it change what you do? Does it change along the journey in terms of what you need to do, in terms of, is it a one-stop shop, you look at it and then you leave it? Could you just tell us a little bit more in terms of when typically groups do start looking at the competitive landscape, and what are the pitfalls if they start too late, and ideally what that should look like?
Yes, well, with a lot of technology, obviously there's regulation, and one of the largest and one of the most important factors to consider is what is your regulatory pathway, if indeed you need one. What we're seeing with digital health, for example, is that there are new pathways being created, and there's a lot of anxiety around whether or not kind of a gold standard around randomized controls are required, for example. But with digital technology, digital health, we're seeing things like N=1 paradigms, which is a new form of experimentation. But in all of these, you really got to consider, how are you going to get to market? And this is, one of the biggest things we're always talking about. But by looking at what others are doing, and I think this is the key, is that you've got to start early. And indeed, you should be doing your research before you even start around an idea of an innovation, to see what's going on. And so we're really like a search engine, like a Google search engine for health innovation. It was a bit of a wacky idea, maybe 6 or 7 years ago when we came up with it, but we could see such rapid advancements happening right across the sectors, and now we're living it. That the kind of data that we're providing to the innovators is really giving them a leg up when they start. Now, with MTP, for example, all the participants in MTP funding, we're giving them a channel so they can monitor their competitors. They can see where they're at in terms of what the sector, and that really enables them to get on top of whether they need more funding to get to market quicker, or what are the pathways to market as well. And that's something that we give visibility through.
Right. And John, I might bring you into the conversation here, because Marcus touched on digital. So can you just comment in terms of the experience with CIMIT around digital technologies in the landscape?
Sure. Actually, before I do that, I want to just reinforce everything that Marcus has said. Too many times we have groups coming to us with these great technologies to solutions that have already been solved. So why waste your time? And I've got to say, the number one failing that we've seen isn't so much a lack of understanding of competitive markets, lack of understanding of need and the economic value that organizations are competing. And I think one of the that's a really tough nut to crack. And I think, to Marcus's point, looking to what competitors are doing, understanding the work they've done, their value propositions, et cetera, allows organizations to really understand. If I really, and to Marcus's point, very early on, before you've got sophisticated prototypes, do a thought experiment. This thing works absolutely perfectly. Who cares? Who's going to pay for it? And you can do that at the idea stage, well before you've spent hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. But getting specifically to digital, we see digital basically operating exactly the same way as everything else, with a major exception of time cycles. That the time cycle on a digital solution can be measured with regulatory and other issues in months as opposed to years. But the process itself remains the same. And you'll see a little bit of what we've been doing with the healthcare innovation cycle is we believe that 4x10 matrix of 10 milestones, 4 domains, remains the same regardless of what type of solution you're going after, be it pharma, digital, health tech. The deliverables, the specific things that you do for each solution, that varies. And our belief, from what we've seen, is it doesn't matter if you're developing a product in Australia or the EU or the US, with the exception of regulatory issues and some reimbursement issues, the process more or less remains the same. And the deliverables would have been very explicit. Again, you're developing a global product, and the specifics to a market will change. Pretty much, one process modified per solution type.
Thanks, John. Now, Kath, I might bring you into the conversation here. You wear many hats. You're a clinician. You've had first-hand experience in a startup company. You're also a venture partner at Brandon Capital. So from your first-hand experience as having a product in development, what does a clinician or research innovator need to do first if they want to develop their early stage ideas to proof of concept?
Thanks, Beck. So I'm definitely going to echo the comments of John and Marcus. So what I had down was, number one, you need to validate the clinical need. So make sure that you have a really good understanding of the clinic, or that make sure that it's an unmet clinical need. Talk to a lot of clinicians about it, and it's not necessarily sharing what your idea is for your solution, but really gaining an understanding of the problem. What are the key sources that, sources of pain? Often we think something's a big deal, but when you go talk to the clinician, it's number 10 on their list of things that they'd like to fix to make their job easier. So really getting a good understanding of that. Then also understanding how big this problem is, how much, to John's point, how much of a health economic burden is it? Where is the value that you're going to be able to create with the solution, or cost that you're going to be able to take out of the healthcare system? And doing an analysis of the various stakeholders. So often it can be very complex, and OncoRes is a great example of that the key decision makers or the end users might not be the key decision makers who will choose to buy the piece of equipment, and that might be different again from the people who will pay for the procedure. So it's really getting an understanding of the various stakeholders, what their drivers are, how you can engage with them, and what their sense of value is, and how you'll be able to address that with the product that you're planning on creating. So that would be my number one thing to do.
And Kath, there's a lot of detail in there, and there's a lot that you need to do. What practical advice did you have in terms of people who are setting out to do this? Like, how did you actually go about that and managing to get the right information and connecting with the right people for that?
Yeah, great question. So it actually took I first saw the OncoRes technology in 2013. And for me, it was complete love at first sight. I'd worked in theatre for years. I could see how this new imaging technology was exactly what I thought the surgeons were looking for, in terms of information under their control, at their fingertips, in real time, to help them to do surgery more accurately. But it actually took us 3 years of working together with the lead clinician, Christabel, and the inventor of the technology, Brendan, to really nail down what the clinical need was. So we did it a lot we talked a lot to other clinicians. We talked to companies that were, offering products in the space. One thing I would say to that is that we managed to do these discussions without giving away what we were actually planning on doing. So very much when you go and talk to these people aren't going to want to sign an NDA for such an early stage really idea. And so what we did was sort of ask questions around, if I had something that could solve, well, number one, do you see this, breast conserving surgery re-excision as a problem? And then if the answer was yes, well, if I had something that could solve that problem, that would give you answers in real time in theatre, would this be something that you would be interested in? So sort of exploring around the problem without actually telling them the ins and outs of how we plan to solve it.
Thanks. And what were the biggest challenges you came across when you were undergoing that process?
Well, probably I'd say similar to the people attending the webinar, was access to funding, which sounds crazy, seeing as I was at that time sitting in a venture capital fund. But it's really, whilst I immediately felt that this was something that we should make an investment in, it's bringing everyone else along for, along that journey, and helping make sure that you can tell a story that will make people, whatever their backgrounds, understand why the clinical need is something that's very unmet and something that people are searching for a solution for, and why you think that your solution is the answer.
Thanks, Kath. And in terms of, I suppose, once you actually got a bit further down the path, ensuring that you had the right people around you and within the team, as a small startup when you started, can you just give us a little bit of an insight in terms of how you went about building your team and collaborations to ensure you did have the right mix of insight and experience?
That's a great question, and particularly extra hard based being when we're based in Perth and we don't have a significantly sized medtech and pharma community. So I think in the very beginning, obviously we were lucky because we had an excellent, before I even arrived, there was an excellent team already, with both Christabel, the lead surgeon, and Brendan, the engineer, being globally recognised in their respective fields in their own rights. So they were a stellar team before I even got involved. But then I guess in the beginning, when we were very fledgling and operating on very little cash, it was a lot of being open to just when you're talking to people. And I think in Perth, often you're very surprised that you'll find incredible people who happen to be here, but may not even know the medtech community exists. And one great example is we ended up meeting someone who was camping on the site next door up at Ningaloo Station, who had a background in ultrasound, and long story short, she ended up being a named author on the paper that we've just published in Cancer Research. So I guess it's always being open. You never know when you're going to meet someone who will be interested and want to join the team or be part of it. So that was one thing. And then finally, recently, with the publicity that we had last year, we've been able to really attract some amazing members. Well, we've got an incredible team. The whole of the team's incredible, but we've had two people recently join. So Simon Graindorge and Tom Curnow. And Simon we knew beforehand, but Tom was aware of us because of the publicity we'd had. So he moved back to Perth with his wife, and he was most recently the global marketing lead for Abbott in vascular, which had an OCT device. So there've been a whole bunch of ways that we've grown the team, but I'm really stoked with the team that we have.
Fantastic. And I suppose with getting back to in terms of what Marcus and John have talked about in terms of having a model for innovation and different aspects to that, did you have any practical tools or resources that you used when you were going through the development stages?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did, so obviously we were incubated within Brandon, so we had a lot of tools and resources and networks available to us. I think last year, one of the most valuable things we did was we entered the MedTech Innovator program. And that, so I'd say, you know, there are so many accelerators out there, and make sure you find one that's fit for purpose. So for the stage that you're at and for what you're hoping to achieve from it. And for us, the MedTech Innovator was perfect. We needed to gain better understanding of the US market. And because it was a global accelerator based in the US, it offered us the perfect introduction to the global medical device network and community, and also helped us enhance our team. So through that program, we were able to get access to Leslie Wise and also the Experian group, who together have helped revamp and drive our market access plan.
Great, thank you. And you've touched on in terms of building your team and resources as well. How did you prioritise the resources that you did have in terms of having a limited team? What have you got, any pearls of wisdom there?
Well, I guess always our mindset has been looking at what our biggest potential point of failure at that time is and trying to solve that. So for example, when we went into when we started up, the space is quite busy. There are a lot of other people trying to solve. It's a well-recognised clinical problem. There are a number of people trying to solve it. So we really wanted to be able to understand what our point of difference was and have some data behind that. And so one of the first things we set out to do was to understand what our diagnostic accuracy was of our technology, because if we weren't going to be up to scratch in terms of that, we didn't want to waste any further time in developing the technology. And so that was a 3-year process, and we designed a very rigorous and large study to prove that in the benchtop setting. This is a study that's just been published in the cancer research, and which showed that our technology has 93% sensitivity and 96% specificity at detecting tumour across a range of breast cancer subtypes. So we knew that if we didn't, if we didn't meet that standard, that it would be game over. So we wanted to make sure that we focused on things that could cause us to fail with the resources that we had to address those first.
Thanks, Kath. That's a really good insight in terms of how you've actually gone about it with your company. So thank you for that. We do have a few questions in the questions box, and I'm just going to hold off on them and come back to them. We're just going to switch the conversation a little bit in terms of the current situation with us currently going through a global pandemic, which has certainly had a huge impact on the medtech pharma space right across the globe. And certainly in terms of getting safe and effective products to market quickly, it's had an impact, as well as impact on ongoing innovations as well. So I'm just going to firstly go to John from a US perspective. How has CIMIT responded to the latest changes with the pandemic? And in terms of if there's been any critical commercialisation learnings from the past that have actually helped you in this situation?
Yeah, really, this has been an absolute perfect storm. It's an unbelievable situation that we've all said that when we're talking to our grandkids, we're going to remember this period of time very, very vividly. Just given the economic impact, the health impact, and the importance that our community can have, frankly, the responsibility, not just the importance, but the responsibility that our community has in being able to help. In particular, I think everyone knows the spread of COVID from asymptomatic patients is a significant problem. And the question becomes, how do we get back to the economy when you don't know who's infectious and who isn't infectious? So as it turns out, CIMIT was called a coordinating center for an NIH and NIBIB funded program called POCTER, Point of Care Technology Research Network. And there were 4 centers that we were supporting with our tools and methodologies. One at Johns Hopkins, one at Northwestern, one at Emory University, and one here in Massachusetts at UMass. And as it turns out, there were a number of point of care technologies that could be adapted to the COVID situation. So we kind of went through the portfolio and went back to NIBIB and said, hey, here are 12 great technologies that with significant funding may be able to make a difference in the near term. And the old expression is, luck is where preparation meets opportunity. Well, that information was given to the head of the NIBIB, who happened to be on a call with Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, and Senator Lamar Alexander, talking about the situation. This was back in early March. And the concern there was that the US was plateauing at about 150,000 tests per day. And everyone recognized that that just was not sufficient. So Senator Alexander basically wrote an op-ed in the New York Times to say, we need to be able to test every American multiple times, which means tens of millions of tests per day. We need that national capacity. He then basically wrote legislation that allocated $1.8 billion with a B to the NIH to be able to put in place a number of different programs. And we were asked as CIMIT to manage one of those programs called RADx Tech. And I think you've got a slide that describes what that program is. So this program is basically was modeled exactly after the CIMIT model. And the idea is that we basically reached out to the community for a national call, actually international call. There were some Australian respondents, as well as New Zealand and across Europe, to have any ideas for how to approach it. Basically, we're looking for two animals. So one is a new project. So that's where someone has an idea that hasn't been proven. Another are scale-ups. So these are ones in the US. There's an emergency use authorization where technologies haven't gone through the full FDA approval process, but due to the emergency, they're approved for use. And the question is, could we rapidly scale those up from thousands to millions of tests? And actually, one of the things in Senator Alexander's op-ed was the point that we need a Shark Tank-like activity. Well, what we're doing is not Shark Tank at all, but that concept really caught on that the NIH, which is really focusing on advancing science, needed to flip and really think about how are they going to get these products into market. So what we're doing at CIMIT, so we've had, let's see, as of this morning, we've had 2,500 applications start. I should say that we got this money turned on April 29th. So it's been an absolute wild ride. And in that time, we've had over 550 applications completed. And we review each of those applications within 24 hours and determine where it goes. For the ones that we think are promising within our timeline, the idea is to get this testing in place by the fall of 2020, not 2021, but this year during a pandemic. How do you get tens of millions of test capacity delivered? So it's a pretty tough screen to both have the technology and have the infrastructure that we can put in place. So what we do is we put that group through what we call a deep dive. And what we do is we parachute in our facilitators. So in this case, we'll talk a little bit about who those facilitators are. But what they do is they basically rip up the proposal and start over, work with the team, understand, because we've got a number of resources that are available to us to do manufacturing scale up, to do clinical trials that the applicant teams didn't know. And also then do planning for how can we really accelerate this as much as possible. And then we have a two-step process from there. The first step is a de-risking process. We call it work package number one. We ask during the deep dive, what are the key risk items? Could be technical, could be supply chain, could be user interface. What are the things that would prevent this from being successful? And one of the important things too that we recognize very early on is success. There's no silver bullet here. Doing a test for a university versus a test that's appropriate for a small business versus a test at an airport or a test at a nursing home or a daycare center. Those use cases are very, very different. So we had to really parse out is which of these technologies are appropriate. And we had identified kind of 7 generic use cases that we needed to design for and understand what the specificity, what all of the requirements were, timelines, cost, all of those sorts of issues. So the ones that passed that screen went into a work package one, and then fortunately we've now had, I can't give you the exact number because it's confidential, but we've had a number of projects that are now finishing work package one and moving into work package two, which is going to be full deployment with the goal of being able to deploy these millions of tests by the fall. I think there's one more, is there one more slide? Yeah. And I think one of the key tools that we use gets back to the healthcare innovation cycle. This is an example of how we have taken that healthcare innovation cycle and implemented it in a platform that we call GAITS, G-A-I-T-S, which stands for Guidance and Impact Tracking System. And what you can see is this is a platform where we show the 10 milestones and then the 4 domains. And within each one of them, we've identified the deliverables that we think are required to be successful. This particular example is really telling that this is on the left is what the applicant who wrote the application came in and told us. This is where we are. You should fund us. Well, then, as I mentioned, we have the SWAT team coming in. And we've had over 100 deep dives at this point. And deep dives are managed by these SWAT teams. Each SWAT team has at least a team lead, and the team lead has more than 30 years of experience in the diagnostics industry. So these folks are really busy, and they've been just tremendously, I've never seen the outreach like we've had here. They've been very helpful in giving up their time, putting aside their businesses, unretiring to jump back in and help. And they're supported by a project facilitator, so typically a project manager, someone with at least 15 years of experience, and then as well a more junior person, assistant project facilitator. In addition, we'll bring in local experts as needed. We did an outreach for technical, clinical, other expertise. We had over 500 people apply. So you can imagine we've got this problem of 500 people that never worked together. We've got these, at this point, about 25 or so deep dive teams who never worked together, who are working under a tremendous time pressure. And fortunately, we had prepared this GAITS platform that basically provided a common language that everyone can say, where is this project? And you get very specific about a deliverable. So on the left is where the team said they were. On the right, you can see that each one of the domains here is in a different color. And each one of these little chiclets represent a specific deliverable that we say is required, and the height of that bar represents how complete it is. So again, probably everyone on the call now can get a pretty good sense that this is a group that's being driven by some business guys that have high aspirations, a little naivete, and this is what happens when optimism and naivete meets experience. So this is an ongoing process. We've got some real winners in here that our fingers crossed are going great, and certainly we hope this is a resource that will make be available to the world over. So it's been quite a ride.
Thanks, John, for that. That's a really good visual in terms of where you think you're at versus where other people with objective eyes perhaps think and expertise think you're at. Just turning to Marcus for a moment now, in terms of the landscape around COVID, the changes around COVID, what have you seen in terms of the changing landscape through your platform and generally in terms of your other commercialisation activities that you do?
Yeah, so since COVID hit, we saw a marked change in the landscape. So in global reporting on what people were working on. So the way we work is we've got a machine learning algorithm that is actually trawling the internet, lots of different sources, social, and bringing that data together into a big repository, and then we make sense out of that. And so we just saw so much activity happening around COVID, and particularly around vaccines and kind of the promise of a vaccine. Health Horizon itself is a subscription service, so our customers, kind of pay for use, and we have some public channels. But what we decided to do was actually help the world effort, and that was to really help the world understand what kind of innovation was being brought to bear on the COVID response. And so we developed this channel, and it's a free channel for anyone to go into, to Health Horizon /coronavirus. And this channel allows people to subscribe. And what we see here is we've got 291 innovations we're tracking with the milestones. And even last week, there were 16 advancements on these particular innovations. And so we can see here things like, what are people actually interested in following? So we get a kind of a consumer view as well as a clinician and innovators view of this whole channel. And what's important is to see what people kind of are really interested in seeing emerge. Obviously, the Johns Hopkins University dashboard, the best data is coming out of Johns Hopkins in terms of the monitoring of the global effort. But what we have here is we've split the innovations up into channels because there's so much innovation happening. There's obviously vaccines, but there's also all the diagnostics, there's drugs and therapies around it. There's also big data innovations, actual innovations around knowledge and the informatics. And then also telehealth, which I mentioned before. Telehealth has really been the winner around the COVID response globally. And that is that the health systems have had to respond. Public health and epidemiology has been the winner in terms of bringing to bear all of that activity that we really want to follow. So if we go into and explore, say, this particular sub-channel, which is around the vaccines under development. We can see there's 65. And if we then go and look at, say, this one, which the world has its eye on at the moment, which is one of the most promising vaccines, which is the one from Queensland University. We can see here some evidence, new evidence, some new funding, and then some mentions in media. So this is how we build our timeline. And so you can see way back here, it received some funding from, you know, kind of one of the associations in Australia. So you can see right back to its early days, potentially here. It got a mention in a journal, and then it got a lot of interest. The interest has been built up. And then we see, this is just in a timeline of 6 months, how much progress this particular innovation has made. So it's very interesting for us monitoring these, what kind of, you know, what people are interested in, but also the progress. And I suppose, you know, we've got, you know, thousands of new subscribers, and a lot of these are, you know, journalists and also the public, and also funders. I mean, the groups like John's, who are helping it from kind of an institute view versus kind of the rest of the world that's interested in the innovation. It's totally changed. Everyone now has an interest in vaccines. Everyone has an interest in the progress. And so this is really rapidly accelerating, not just you know, kind of the technical sector, but actually the public sector, and also the interested in funds. There's a lot of donations, for example. There's been a huge upturn in people donating to medical research groups and the like, and we're seeing those emerge. It's quite fantastic, because we in the kind of e-health digital world have been really paused for about 15 years in trying to get the breakthroughs required, and nothing like a pandemic to sharpen everyone's resolve about what's important and what we need to be focused in. And so I think it's actually heralding a golden time for us in picking and choosing which innovations we champion, which ones we provide funding, which ones we help on their journey. It's so as much as the pandemic's been bad, there are some good things come out of it, and breaking old business models, for example. No one says this is how we used to do things. We're all saying, how can we now do things better? That's it's a good thing from my perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. And you've touched on a good point there in terms of there's opportunities that have come out of this, changing how we do things as well. So, Kath, I just wanted to bring you into the conversation here in terms of getting your thoughts on what you see as the opportunities that have come out of this situation in terms of health innovations.
Thanks, Beck. Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, from OncoRes's perspective, it certainly has intensified the need that we're looking to address, which is patients having to go back into hospital again to have a further operation. So in times like these, it's even more important to get it right the first time. So from that point of view, it's an opportunity. But they've also been, like Marcus said, it's an opportunity also to change business models really fast. We previously, on our first attempt to get our first clinical site up and running, it took us over 2 years to get both ethics and governance approved. It took us 3 days to extend that to another hospital in the craziness at sort of middle of March, which is fantastic. It's also, I think, opened the world even more for Australia, and particularly for Perth, because people are getting used to doing things on webinars. And so the travel that we used to have to do, and, you know, we were, I know one of the other medtech CEOs from Perth always said, if you're going to do something like this from Perth, you've got to get on an aeroplane as if you were just catching the bus to work. So that has changed things dramatically for us. I think people are much more open to webinars, particularly in the US. I know that a few months ago, Johnson & Johnson closed their first venture investment where they'd done the entire thing virtually from the very first meeting. So in terms of funding opportunities and international opportunities, there's going to be a lot more available for us. and people are definitely very willing to entertain other more innovative ways of doing things that previously they wouldn't. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. And then finally, just in terms of one thing that's really exciting for me is to see the new collaborations that are being created to help secure our supply chains and to help support local manufacturing, develop more local manufacturing. We had Brendan, our chief scientist, you know, within a very short space of time, there was a collaboration up and running between Brendan, WA's chief scientist, Peter Clinken, a 3D printing company, you know, who hadn't worked together with the sector before. And within 2 weeks, they were, they had TGA approved face masks that they were already manufacturing. So I do think that there's plenty of opportunity for us.
Fantastic. Thanks for your insights there, Kath, the real world experience there. And certainly this is another example of being able to open up an audience in terms of using webinars. So that international or interstate perspective is loud and clear, I think, in terms of the opportunity to broaden our networks and connectivity. Dan, might bring you into the conversation in terms of the Australian flavour, in terms of across the MTP sector, with the impact that COVID's had on us in Australia, how it's impacted collaboration, and what we can learn from that experience.
Thanks, Rebecca. Look, I think all of our guests have sort of pointed out that COVID has brought some opportunities to the sector, and that's great for companies who could pivot and take advantage of the situation. But there's been a host of other companies in the sector that have been significantly impacted in a negative way. And so 2 weeks ago, we published a report in partnership with LEK Consulting on the impact of COVID in the Australian medtech, biotech, and pharmaceutical sector. And that report's available on our website for people to download. And that report demonstrated that over 50% of the companies that we engaged with, and we engaged with 80 key leaders in companies and organizations around Australia, 80%, more than 50% of them said that their organization was either highly impacted or moderately impacted in a negative way by COVID. And only a small fraction of those companies saw a positive impact of COVID. Now, that's not to say that COVID was bad for everyone. And as a supplementary report, we published work on how the MTP sector itself came together to support Australia's needs during COVID. And, you know, it's hard to believe that COVID really only became a pandemic on the 11th of March. It's not that long ago, but a huge amount has happened. And Kath touched on some of those things. You know, early on, the federal government established the Health Industry Coordination Group and a number of task forces to bring together people to really make sure that Australia had access to critical healthcare technologies, goods, and services. The Medical Technology Association of Australia took on a coordinating role, and we're able to bring together companies across the sector, regulators, government, researchers, to really ensure that Australia is well positioned to have enough ventilators, enough PPE, to have ICU supplies in place should the pandemic really hit Australia hard. I think that's probably one of the most exciting things I've seen in our sector, is everybody coming together to make sure that Australia was positioned well to respond. That involved the regulator. So TGA coming on board and establishing accelerated approval processes for a whole host of things. It involved the ACCC giving exemptions. So the companies could actually come together and talk about their order sheets and understand which states, which healthcare organizations across Australia had ordered ventilators, making sure that we were well positioned. But it also involved companies like Gray Innovation coming together to produce new ventilators, small companies coming together like Epichem out in WA to pivot and produce hand sanitizers, gin manufacturers putting their stills to work, perhaps unfortunately to move away from making gin and making alcohol for hand sanitizers. So I think the industry itself stepped up, but there were challenges, and we'll still see big challenges in the months to come, because as those industries stepped up and pivoted, we saw a whole host of things having a negative impact. clinical trials in Australia got shut down largely because people couldn't access, people running trials couldn't access hospitals. Patients didn't want to go there. So we saw a significant slowdown in clinical trials. We saw university research facilities closing down. And as a result, small companies who depended on those facilities to do their research were challenged in being able to deliver on projects. We saw a number of companies, and we spoke to venture capitalists, a number of companies who were in those sort of late preclinical, early clinical stage, standing down significant numbers of staff so that they could conserve their cash until when those trials and those preclinical studies could resume. And so we had an impact on jobs. Big impact, obviously, on universities and foreign students not being able to come into the country. Huge impact, not just on universities' abilities to teach, but also on the funding they derive from those students. That's used to support research. And so we see a flow-on effect as international students aren't able to come to Australia. We see a flow-on effect of less funding available for our early career and mid-career researchers. You know, people we talked to suggested there could be a generational loss in medtech and biotech companies as a result of COVID. So I think there's good things and there's bad things, and I think we really need to, you know, sort of focus on some of the things that Marcus talked about, like breaking business models. You know, we are seeing now that pharma companies are working to accept electronic signatures on clinical trial documents. You know, who would have thought that it would take a pandemic to get to the point where we could manage to sign documents electronically? Telehealth, you know, the ability to phone your physician and have online consultation without going and sitting in a waiting room full of people who you probably don't want to be around at this point. You know, fantastic, being able to just go and pick up your prescription. All of those things are really exciting, but I think the key for the sector, and one of the key things that our two reports points out, is that we do need to make sure we don't go backwards. So as we come out of COVID-19, and much of the country is doing very well, and here in Victoria things aren't quite as rosy at the moment, but as we do come out of COVID-19, I think we have to make sure that we don't go back to those old business models. We need to continue to use you know, the electronic media that we've managed to use today for a webinar with 130 people online. I love the fact that Kath is traveling less, and my family loves the fact that I'm not on an airplane every 3 or 4 days traveling nationally and internationally. So I think there's some really good things, but indeed we will see that, you know, some of our companies, some of our researchers are impacted by a reduction in funding. You know, the whole access to labs, how do we run our labs now? How do we do our clinical trials? All of those things have to be worked through. And if you watch this space in August, we'll publish a second report with LEK, again, looking at some of the things that the sector might need to do to really make sure that we pick up and we get that tech bump that everybody's talking about. You know, we saw that in the end of 2019, we had a very strong sector. We've had a significant impact on that sector over the last 3 or 4 months. We need to really work hard to get back to that. And I think we have great potential to do that, but we do have to make sure that, you know, as I said, and as Marcus said, we focus on some of these activities that are breaking business models and really make sure we don't go backwards.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. I do want to leave time for people to be able to have some of their questions answered. We've had quite a few questions. Some may have been answered along the way, and we'll try to get through as many as we can with the time we've got left. One particular question that's got quite a few thumbs up, a few likes there for us to ask, is probably for John. One of the roadblocks experienced is contractualising the IP amongst partners and future investors. Does CIMIT introduce any processes to facilitate that?
Yeah, we did. And one of the key things that we found is that when you start collaborations, you should agree on the IP terms right at the start. Once you wait until the end and there's money on the table, everyone wants a cut. So what we have is a very simple agreement. Whenever we fund any organizations, when there are multiple collaborators, they agree that one organization will take the lead in prosecuting the IP. All the other ones will follow their lead, or they can always opt out. and the intellectual property is shared equally, no matter what the level of contribution is. And frankly, you know, it's so infrequent that that value is actually created. The amount of time and energy that goes into parsing out something where there's no value is a complete waste of time. So that has been something that's worked for us really exceptionally well.
And do you think there's any differentiators in your experience that are early signals of potential success when you get these programs in?
Well, that's one of the things that we're doing within the GAITS program as well, is that we're collecting real-time metrics. Number of patients impacted, number of institutions using things, intellectual property, career progression, a number of real-time metrics as opposed to just waiting for the end. And frankly, our hope and goal is, as we're collecting this information on thousands of projects, that we'll start to be able to get signatures when projects are kind of on the right trajectory, or that projects that are heading in the wrong direction and need an intervention. That is a ways off. But I do think, without question, the most important thing that we see over and over and over and over again is I would put groups in two different buckets. There are some people that are passionate about the problem, and others that are passionate about the technology. And the ones that are successful are the ones that are passionate about the problem and understanding how they can solve it and create value.
Great, thank you for that. And just a reminder, we do have the slide up now which prompts you how to write a question into the Q&A box, and you can tick that you want it to be anonymous if that's what you choose as well. We did have a question for Kath in terms of where you're currently up to with your technology and what's your biggest challenge at the moment.
Great question. So we are currently, as I said, we've got a diagnostic accuracy for our technology on the benchtop. We then also, one of the other big questions for us was, can we even put this technology into a handheld probe? Because the signal to noise ratio is so wrong, we're looking for microscale changes in the patient's tissue, but the surgeon's hand movements are going to be so much noisier than what we're looking for. So the team managed to put the technology into a handheld probe, get images similar to the benchtop, and we commenced our in vivo clinical trial at the end of last year. So this is an initial trial of learning. We are scanning the surgeons. We've had 5 surgeons use it on around 12 patients to date, and we're learning a lot from being able to do that. So that's the stage that we're currently at. And we're looking to enter formal product development now for the probe that will go into our large clinical trials.
Great, exciting times there, Kath.
Yeah.
Now I've got a question for Marcus that has popped up. Where do you source the information on innovations? Is it provided by the innovators, or do you independently research and monitor the landscape?
Yeah, great question. So we've got this pretty special thing. Everyone's got a machine learning kind of program, but what we've built is little agents that go out. Every time we find an innovation, we put an agent to watch that particular space, watch that, you know, it might be from a university, might be from an incubator, might be from a public news source. And what we do is we monitor those, and they go into this big kind of collection area where they get curated by an AI and an expert. And so the AI becomes an expert at watching what the innovation space is all about. And so we bring all those innovations together in a curated fashion. So all the innovations are, they're all evidence-based. So we have this kind of a low bar, but it's actually quite a high bar. And so all those innovations are come from basically public sources, but also the innovators themselves can notify us of those, and then we go put them into the curation process themselves. So they come from a whole lot of different areas, tens of thousands of places, hundreds of thousands of places actually.
Thanks, Marcus. Now this next question, probably John or Marcus or both could have a go at answering this. And the question is, when the problem is an issue for patients, but not clinicians, and more of an ethical issue rather than an economic issue, is it impractical to develop a solution for it since there's no clear payer? There's a few complexities there.
Yeah, I've seen that question, and I think this is really a great question because it really does come down to that so much time and energy is spent on a technical innovation, and not enough time is spent on a business innovation. There are a number of technologies that have seen some really critical problems. One, I will give one example, some group that we're working on in Europe, where it was post-operative cognitive decline. So when people go in, particularly elderly people go in for surgery, it's unclear what the mechanisms are, but quite often there is a significant cognitive decline leading to dementia at a much higher rate after many surgeries. Probably some type of inflammation cascade, and no one knows what that is. Surgeons don't care, frankly. Patients and their families care a lot, and I shouldn't say surgeons don't care. Surgeons really are focused on the success of the surgery as opposed to the long-term health of the patient. They don't see it, so there's no way for them to know. So we spent a long time with this team really looking at the economic models and understanding an issue for patients ultimately becomes an issue for payers. If it's causing all sorts of issues, and the question is who that payer is, how do you demonstrate that economic value? So again, the team did a great job from a technology perspective, but they put in a significant amount of time to really understand where was the economic value created, and how do you now turn that into a viable business model? And they're now doing gangbusters. So I really do think that this idea that technology does not equal an innovation. An innovation is a package that creates and delivers value, and you just have to figure out, how you extract a part of that value to be sustainable. Easily said, hard to do.
So I just want to answer also in digital health. Obviously, there's a lot of different business models, and I see several. I'm a chair of an accelerator program, for example, and we've had 3 digital health innovators come through, and it's not always evident, kind of who pays, but kind of in perseverance along the lines of like getting medical insurers to pay, for example. One particular one I have in mind, which is a digital therapy, basically an app that you download, and it helps you with chronic pain. And it's like, how can an app help with chronic pain? But it uses kind of a graded exposure methodology, which is really about retraining your brain to not go seeking the pain-seeking mentality, which is like, kind of this is what happens with people with chronic pain. So what we've realized, though, is that individuals are willing to pay themselves. And indeed, the process, therefore, you go through is to validate, the evidence base, so that you're getting accumulated evidence over time. Where it does no harm, it's then about efficacy. And so, if you don't have the burden of proof and the whole trial structure around harm, then efficacy is an important thing. So this is where we're seeing digital health really changing, and hence direct to consumer is a valid pathway. It's not always through some kind of existing structure of payment, which obviously we're all burdened with in the health system, of what someone else paying, the payer problem, as they call it in the US. So look, I see these really emerging, and not only around really hard innovations as well, even around dietary, around management of secondary things in chronic disease, for example, behaviours and things like that. They're all there are ways to actually get people to pay, and people buy Fitbits themselves and medical devices. Germany's a nation of people who buy medical devices for home monitoring. That's coming, kind of to everyone else very soon.
Thank you both for your insights there. Dan, I've got a question for you, perhaps. In terms of developing the workforce, have you got any advice on what new graduates, postgrad or researchers can do to contribute to the Australian medtech pharma innovation market, especially in light of COVID changes?
Thanks, Beck. I think that question is, what can they do to get into the market? And I think that's a valid question, because we have more PhD students registered in Australia than we have academic positions. So clearly, new graduates from undergraduate courses also need to find jobs. And one of the things that you can do is obviously get experience by volunteering, doing short internships, networking, but there are also some practical things you can do. Queensland University of Technology runs the Bridge and the Bridge Tech program, partially funded by MTPConnect through our READY program, and previously through our project fund. Great opportunity to understand all of the skills, get a broad brush understanding of all of the skills needed to commercialize technologies. And so there are those programs that they can engage in. I'd encourage them to reach out to the Bridge and Bridge Tech program. They take about 100 registrants into each of those programs each year. So that's one thing you can do. But of course, the other thing is to do like Kath has done and Marcus, and be entrepreneurial and create your own job. And I think we'll see more and more of that, and being able to leverage the tools that CIMIT and through the GAITS technology, being able to leverage those, being able to develop your own technologies, and actually creating your own jobs is a great way to go.
Thanks, Dan. Now, I'm going to just ask one last question. I apologise for other people who have not had their questions answered, but just one last question for Kath. The question is, thanks for the great example in terms of your work. What are the parameters to be evaluated to decide when the scientific development is sufficiently advanced to lodge a patent and cover the intellectual property of a product?
Excellent question. So that is always a decision that you need to weigh up in terms of timing, because as soon as you file your patent, you're obviously going to start incurring costs, which are small in the beginning, but rapidly within sort of the 2.5 kind of year time frame become quite significant. So that's got to be weighed up along with what the stage of development. So what proof do you have to show that your idea actually works? And what's the other, perhaps having a look at Health Horizons and seeing what the other activity in the space is. So are you going to, do you need to file something now just in case someone else is, working around the same space and might file something similar? So there are a lot of things to consider, and I would suggest going to talk to a patent attorney, and you can go talk to them really, really early. And certainly in WA, there are lots of patent attorneys that will give you an opinion at that stage for free, and you can continue to talk to them as you develop your proof to go alongside your patent, and make a combined decision there. And I guess the most important thing is don't publish anything, don't disclose anything until you have a patent around your technology, until also you're sure that you're going to be able to have the evidence to support your patent within that first 12 months of filing.
Thanks, Kath. And I might just sneak in one more question for you that's popped up before we wrap up. Does OncoRes collaborate with other sectors such as mining, for example, to idealise around what tech is working at that large scale to identify targets, then apply into your medtech? So looking outside the sector.
I think it's so important to look at outside the sector. I think it's so often so commercialisation is very much a team sport. We have a very diverse thinking team within our team itself. I think absolutely it's always worth looking outside, seeing what works elsewhere, and seeing where we can translate it into working into the medtech sector. We have investigated a couple of things with OncoRes. Nothing's happened yet, but great question, and very important to always keep an open mind.
Thanks, Kath. And thank you to everyone for your participation in terms of submitting questions to be answered. I apologise that we did not get through all of them. but hopefully this has given you a good insight, and you've got connections, virtual connections now in terms of our speakers to follow up outside of the webinar. I'm going to hand over to Jared Gibbs now, our Senior Director of the BMTH program, just to wrap up the last few minutes.
Thank you, Rebecca. As many of you have heard today, MTPConnect supports and develops the medtech, pharma and digital health sector through several programs and initiatives, examples of which there include the Biomedical Translation Bridge program and the Biomedtech Horizons program. Now, I'm fortunate enough to be the Senior Director of the Biomedtech Horizons program, which has so far delivered 2 rounds of funding, totaling about $18 million. And we're in the very final stages of our 3rd round of funding. BMTH supports research activities of SMEs that are developing promising medical device technologies that are addressing an unmet clinical need. The program provides support to develop their proof of concept, pushing it closer to the market. And there is a very specific focus on translating to commercial outcomes. Now, discussions like these today contribute to part of our program, developing commercialization awareness in the projects that we've supported through BMTH, and services like Health Horizons that we've heard from Marcus, and also GAITS are important pieces of the puzzle that we'll look to take on board to continue developing and supporting the Australian MTP sector. So we heard a little bit today from Kath Giles at OncoRes, who's given some inkling as to what it takes to move a product towards a market launch. I guess extreme focus, a great technology foundation and great data, relentless networking, and also delicate conversations. Critically, she highlighted the need to validate the clinical need and also have a thorough understanding of the health economics. So some key critical points from Kath there. We learned from Marcus Dawe, having led innovation and commercialization activities across a range of industries, what he's doing now in the health innovation sector in the product and service Health Horizons, which is helping both companies and consumers alike to stay abreast of developments in their specific areas of interest. And how they've used that service, Health Horizons, to help businesses stay tuned to the various competitive challenges that they might face, and also develop an understanding of the economic value of the innovations that they're working on. We learned from John Collins the experience that CIMIT has developed over about the last 20 years, helping innovators create health technologies and getting them to market. The healthcare innovation framework and the GAITS tool that they've created highlight the critical nature of teams and collaboration, and this work over that time laid the groundwork for the rapid innovation challenge that they've faced recently with the RADx challenge for COVID-19. And this highlights to me the essential nature of building and refining these systems, because you never know, one day they might just be needed to fast track innovations that are critical to help a lot of people. Dan mentioned right at the top that we need to work harder in Australia to improve translation, and there's evidence that COVID is driving that change, but there remain some systemic challenges that we need to keep focused on. I'm conscious of the fact that we're right at the end of our session, so I'll wrap up there and I can hand back to Beck. Thanks, Beck.
Thanks so much, Jared, for that wrap up. And it's just back to me to really thank everyone for tuning in today, for the audience, for your participation with your questions. And I'd really like to thank our guest speakers, John, Kath and Marcus, as well as Dan, for joining us today. If you can, please do take a moment to leave us some feedback. There'll be a survey link that will appear on your screen as you log out. It's anonymous, so please do contribute. We're always happy to take feedback in terms of our webinars for the next one that we do. And it's a quick survey, so there's a bonus for you too. So on that, I will thank you all, and I look forward to our next webinar in the end of July. Thank you.